Wow. We've got a miserable rainy day here in New England. Not a particularly special thing. We get that fairly often, but anyway, but it's so dark, this is going to be a very different look. I think I'm going to turn the lamp on. Let's see if that helps us any. Certainly make it possible for me to see a little bit better. This has been, this last group of questions is wonderfully excellent. I don't know, we've had some good questions, but this group of four, and I'm not going to do them consecutively. I'm going to do them intermittently, but they are some very good questions. One of them is an older one, though, and I want to get onto that because it covers so much. It covers so much of what's going on today. Anyway, so let me see. This one it says, can you discuss the teaching at Grand Central Academy? And it just so happens I can a little bit, having just spoken to some people who have worked there for some while. And one was a former student of mine. And the question is this the realism that is achieved by outlining, then filling in the color that you often refer to? I've seen Grisaille paintings by their students that have the color applied and modeled very carefully, starting at the top and coming down like a curtain to the bottom of the painting over a carefully drawn Grisaille. So there are a number of things that I've learned, and I'm not here to report on anybody. And my analysis, by the way, whenever I do it, is really for the purposes of helping people to understand what we do, And, now you can take the position that what we do is what's done, it's the best thing, it's the greatest, oldest, whatever. I don't do that. I actually think we do have some amazing stuff going on from the point of view of history, but this isn't a tribal issue. It's, we're all in this little boat where we're trying to figure out, having had the knees cut out from under us by what became the art establishment very quickly about the turn of the century, just after the turn of the last century, when a lot of nasty stuff happened in the United States around 1913. And a lot of dangerous things happened that have come to roost since then. You can call it you can say that's a political statement, but it really isn't a political statement. Politics was involved in every possible way, and the politicization of the art schools is obviously direct evidence that was what was going on. But people would like to have us believe that politicization of art was just, that was just the way the trends were going to go, and it just isn't. It just wasn't. When the state in France, whoever was, had hegemony at the time, whoever was in power, they got what they wanted out of artists. They'd pay the big prices and get what they wanted, and by way of propaganda, by way of preaching. That's all that's happened here in the States around that time. The reason the Boston School guys quit teaching, I think I've mentioned this before, is because the institution, the Museum of Fine Arts, the school of the Museum of Fine Arts, had been taken over by something, right? By entities, not artists. And at that point, that was happening across the country, and it wasn't very long after that when all these schools were throwing away their casts, stopped doing drawing in a systematic way, and so on. And so, and it was wide-ranging phenomena. It was happening in London as well as Pennsylvania, or Philadelphia, as well as Boston and New York. The Art Students League. I think they walked to the East River with their casts and threw them in one blissful day. And then, of course, when I get there, I wonder what happened to the drawing. Well, there's an attitude change here. It used to be, the founding, the Renaissance was founded on the idea of going back and finding the good. What have we lost? We've lost our moorings. What is it that we really love? And you go back and you find these great Greek, the era of Phidias and these guys, and you just know that we don't have anything right now compared to that. And a similar thing is happening in sort of the representational painting of today, where we're looking at all this junk that's being called art. And now this is not to be a negative thing, this today's conversation, but when it becomes politics instead of art, we're not talking about the same critter. And despite the fact that historically, people paid big dollars to have their propaganda painted out in images. So Yeah, and all the way from Mao to Mussolini to Stalin. I mean, all these guys were in that game, Hitler. But let's get on with today's subject. I don't know how. You know, it was a Gabriel. I want to blame Gabriel for this. I just happened to be reading one of his questions, and it's not one of those for anytime soon, Gabriel. So lay low. But the politicization question. But no. So we're all trying to get ourselves back on our feet, right? I mean, when I was young, I couldn't find a place to study where anybody taught what the things were that I loved in the arts. And I was very inclined to sculpture and painting and not to 10 other things. So, so I was very aware of what was happening in that is, say, the knowledge that was available through, say, an Encyclopedia Britannica. But, and I do that, I said, because I was virtually limited to that in my early education. Although sometimes I like to remember that I was also sitting there looking at a Gilbert Stuart every single day, all year, when I was a 5-year-old and a 6-year-old in this little quote unquote one-room schoolhouse. Yeah, real. It's not real. I'm not making that part up. It was a one-room schoolhouse with a divider down the middle so that there could be 2 grades in it or whatever. So anyway, but yeah, that's actually what got me started in painting, was just literally looking at that unfinished, the Smithsonian George Washington, seeing a finished nose and looking back at this scrabbly, sort of scratchy paint you could tell had been made by a paintbrush. And I've been on that, as I said before, I've been on that hunt ever since, and so many of you have and are. And I commend you and recommend you dig deep and don't take counterfeits. Don't look to the left or the right, as I like to say. Anyway, the question from Louise, I take that back, I'm sorry, not Louise, from Elizabeth. Can you discuss the teaching at Grand Central Academy? Yeah, I learned a couple things that, maybe I'm the only one talking about it. They probably would tell you the same thing if they had a program like this, or I made a talk like this. But I learned that they do a lot of different things, and they seem to go a little bit in waves. They have one way of thinking for a while, and another time, depending on certain influences. People come in and, so it sounds like more of a freewheeling exchange to me, the way they talk about the place. I know that there's some systematic stuff done where people sit down at tables or whatever and do still lives. And so I know that's all going on at the same time. That's not what you're really asking about. Let's focus on what you're asking. You said you saw a Grisaille in which they started painting the color from the top of the head and painted down to the foot. And that's modeled by the video online of Jacob Collins himself, just simply talking about, or demonstrating rather, and he throws up some sort of rough generalization about the sort of the general, well, I think you'd call it the construction of the figure, since it was done with angular lines and that sort of thing. And then he starts at the top and is just simply systematically drawing his way to the bottom. And this is just the drawing part, never mind the other side. So it doesn't surprise me at all that you've seen a Grisaille in which color moves down. And I've been told that is what a significant part of what is being taught there. So, and yet I'm going to give them this, that in the Museum of Fine Arts, something rather like it was being taught. The real difference, in other words, I've seen drawings. I have one in my studio actually from one of the possibly the museum school. I think not, but there were 3 or 4 places, Coles and other places, normal school at one point, where drawing was being taught systematically. And so I have several drawings in my studio from that era, from the 1890s probably or so. And you can plainly see a pretty precise outline. In one case, I saw a drawing from the Museum of Fine Arts that was in Gamel's possession from a student at the Museum of Fine Arts, in which the articulation of the outline was so fine. It was like so completely finished, but also so exquisite. That there was not any, it wasn't a rough draft. It certainly wasn't construction drawing. And then there's noodling. So this thing was modeled probably from the head down to about the chest, something like that. So that isn't actually an unusual thing. It isn't an unusual approach. I don't think it recommends itself when you know more about the nature of relational thinking, and even of form itself. Because this modeling, like in a band going down this way, isn't the same thing for you if you're looking at, for example, a passage on the leg or on a shoulder, and you're seeing a form traveling this way. Do you really want to model it in little tiny bits I'm trying to picture one of those little machines we used to have when we were a kid, those little giant children's devices, finding your way down the side. Because drawing is a relational thing, and so one form talks to another form, and don't we set up forms to talk to each other, or do we simply model our way down, and when we get to the bottom, we sign our name? And I'm not saying that's what they do. I'm not saying it. I'm not even really actually concerned. I just want this, with what anybody else does, the Grand Central Academy or Jacob Collins or anybody. It's not really the issue. There's just some interesting points here that can be made. So what you're seeing in a conversation that Paxton carries on, he talks about a floating line in the first place, right? And he says any fool can close a line. So the idea of a floating line, but then you talk with Sargent and you talk about the long line. Draw as long a line as you can remember. In other words, he's talking about the actual shape, the actual beautiful contour line. He's saying draw that long line with as much authority as you can and as long as you can. And yet, in every case, these guys are actually having you set these things out there and, as it were, floating them one against the other. I've often found, for example, you can set up a passage that maybe come over a part of the head down through the neck, and the next thing you know, you draw something down to set up the top and bottom. You draw something on the foot. And the minute you draw that piece on the hip, there's so much data, so many beautiful relationships potentially there on a figure. But it's at that point when you actually have real lines suggesting real things, talking to each other, in as it were, real life, the look of nature life, that you really begin to understand our game a bit, and that other game, which isn't that noodling from the top to bottom game. So I really want to talk about this primarily to suggest that, and other people can work how they want. And I'm sure they have very good reasons, and maybe some good things come out of those strategies. There will come up a whole discussion as we go along in a day or two, or I should say a couple talks down the road, where we talk about the nature of being all over the place at once. So I'm not going to overwork that one right now. But let's see if there's anything else that this person said that I should talk about. And otherwise, we don't have to carry on. Is this the realism that's achieved by outlining and filling in the color that you often refer to? Yeah, so it actually is in a way, but it doesn't have to be done that way. You don't have to do it from top to bottom in that way. You still can do a beautiful outline. And when I was with Gamble, actually did do that. We were actually encouraged to do a beautiful outline. Truly find the shadow lines up the entire figure and find the great forms and get the whole thing talking at once. And there was never anything like modeling down from the top to the bottom, and yet it was all, we'd certainly really worked our outlines. We most definitely did. Gamble, the first thing you do when he'd set a cast in front of you, would expect you to deliver him. He'd tell you, I would just want a clean outline of this thing, just make it look exactly like. And he didn't suggest you use construction drawing, and I don't think any of us did. I certainly didn't. I'd already been through that at the Art Students League, and so there was an absolutely horrendous event, especially to the degree that the marks are going to stay there and screw up a beautiful drawing potentially. But the worst part of it, and the one thing I did want to add to this today, was this whole question of neural energy. Something I've just found, and I think I can bring back the name of the book in a second. What is it called? The Organized Mind. And it's a book that came out just a few years ago. But this question of neural energy, one of the reasons I paint the way I do, and I think the Boston School guys found this to be true as well, which is that I really try to set up all the major stuff in the start, is because there's so much better energy, you're a stronger person. And there's a dwindling down. So if you delay big decisions, if you fill up the canvas with lots and lots of stuff, and then later on literally every painting has this tendency toward exhaustion, right? I used to say it's like humans. We're like a battery. We just run out of gas. I found that every project does actually. And they just get more and more puny. They just don't do what they used to do when they were fresh batteries. And I found that to be true. So I follow that model. I found it crucial to follow a model where you actually deal with the most important things and the major things in the start. So, and it's because of this loss of neural energy, which I didn't have a name for until actually last year when I found this book. Thank you, Carol. And that really does kind of sum it up. And And the idea of curtain shading, or what I've called window shading and that sort of thing, that's a term that they use, the people around them use. So I think that covers it. You know, think about this, that when you want to get further into what I'm really talking about, ask me more specific questions. Someone did, and I think one of the next ones I do, and I think is the one from Louise. And Louise, distinguished from Louisa in this case, Louise is asking, and I'm trying to do this really soon, maybe even tomorrow, is it possible for you to discuss painting starts from the fog in more depth and perhaps show some examples in one of your upcoming discussions? I'm assuming that preliminary compositional drawings have been made on complex subjects first, i.e. interior scenes or complex still life setups. Now, I've already communicated a little bit to Louise, but I definitely am going to do this. I'll try to do it in the very next video, Louise. So, but all these things correlate. This is a very different way of working from a lot of what goes on in illustration, but for sure a lot of what went on in academy, academe, in the days of the salon painters and stuff like that. But even then, I've seen evidence in the past that those guys weren't simply drawing outlines and noodling from top to bottom, which I myself have done. Like everything, everybody's done everything, haven't we? So thank you very much. Please do subscribe, like, hate, whatever you want to do, and share, especially if you hate it, share it. And then make your comments, ask your questions, and enjoy the rain otherwise. So thank you. See you next time.